You have had a fascinating life. Just give us a little bit of it. Can I just ask you a few questions because we all want to know?
Sometimes it's very nice not to know everything about it.
Okay, you don't have to tell, just a select few.
All right.
You tell the details that you want to share.
Okay.
But I just want to go over your life a little bit. And I want to remind you of one thing.
This is a setup. I just want you to know that.
Totally. But we know that you are familiar with the theater. You're very comfortable on stage, and early on in your career, you wanted to be in the theater. Can you tell the story about Shelley Winters and you in the theater?
This was... I've told this story a lot, I have to say. I think it's out there.
Okay.
All right. I desperately wanted to act, and if I couldn't land that, I loved set and costume design, and I also loved direction. And I was very lucky. I went to a high school with a phenomenal theater program, would you believe? At any rate, they opened a summer stock theater in our area. Now, summer stock is where, these shows would tour, and I talked myself into a job as an apprentice. Now, what an apprentice does is all the dirty work. Shelley Winters came in with a show. I don't know if any of you remember Shelley Winters, but a brilliant actress. But I think this was a very troubled time in her life because she was married to Anthony Franciosa, who had a roving eye. And I don't think Shelley was the most secure woman in the world. And every time you'd go past her dressing room, she'd be on the phone with Hollywood, and she couldn't help it. She whined. She had that high-pitched voice. And you heard things you really never want to hear about a woman and her husband and, all of that. And we were all, don't bother her. Well, my job after a show was to sweep the stage. You had these big, wide brooms. And I'm sweeping the stage, with my head down, and I hit her. I mean, she was standing in the middle of this thing, and I just ran into her, and I apologized and whatever. And the next morning, the man who had the theater called me into his office and said I was fired. That Miss Winters was very upset that obviously I had hit her, and I didn't belong in the theater. And that was to, a 16-year-old kid, like telling me my future was gone. And I went home to tell my mother in tears. And my mother fought very hard not to burst out laughing because her line, this was a classic line from my mother. She said, "Lynn, you've been fired from a non-paying job." She didn't understand at all.
So speaking of your mother, what was she had a career plan for you. She had a different career path than the one you eventually, what was her plan for you?
Well, her plan for me was that I was going to be a secretary. I went to school, when in college I went to a school where you could have dual majors and dual minors. So my majors were in philosophy and English, and my minors were in art and theater. Now, I ask you, is there any chance of getting a job? She had a good idea, at least getting, those were the days where you were supposed to be a secretary. And then I was going to meet someone wonderful, and I was going to marry them.
Right, and then that would be the end of the job.
That would be the end of the job, yes. And I didn't want any part of that. I couldn't wait. I remember Catherine Lanfer, who you may not know, but Catherine was part of the station for a long time. And Catherine told me the story about being raised in a tiny town somewhere, and we were talking about how we wanted to get out of where we grew up. It's the normal thing, I think. And she said she used to have planes going overhead, and she'd lean out the window with flags signaling, "Get me out of here!" It was hysterical. Anyway, I'm sorry, it's a very long answer.
You have a great story that you had a very similar plan. You wanted to get out of New Jersey. You wanted to go to Europe, and when you were a little kid, what did you try to do?
Oh, yeah, okay. We used to spend our summers on the Jersey Shore. My mother and father did not want me to be afraid of the water, and my father taught me to swim when I was a very little kid, and he also explained to me that if I ever panicked, I couldn't touch bottom, I could flip over and float and rest, and then I could go on swimming. Well, the other thing that fit into this story was I was very curious about what was on the other side of the water. And he said, Europe. Everybody said, Europe. And I think I was 4 or 5. And one day, my mother and father are on the beach, and they look up, and there is this little steam engine, you know, with the arms going, heading beyond the breakers, just heading straight east. And the lifeguard, you know, gets a look too, and then at that moment, the fins appeared. And now I know this story now because it's family lore. You hear it so often.
Yeah,
I have
yeah.
no idea. You know, I have one memory from it. But at any rate, evidently, my father hit the water the same time the lifeguard did with a boat or a float thing, and they're swimming like crazy. And that's when I was tossed in the air. And this, I think I remember, of this rough sort of feeling and going flying in the air. I completely panicked. It was dolphins.
Oh. Amazing.
Yeah, and they
Amazing.
got me, and you know, between the tears of, oh, she's okay, I was scolded up the kazoo, but I wanted to go to Europe. It was very logical. I could float, and I could...
And eventually you got there, and maybe years
It was a
later,
dry-
and
I'll
maybe
tell
you took an
you,
airplane, but...
It took a long time, but I did get there, yes.
Okay, let me ask you one more question. Can you tell us a story about when you set yourself on fire? Every cook should have a story about when they set themselves on fire and then came out of it fine.
All right. These were the days, I don't think this is news anymore, when I mean, in the sense that everybody does it, when my husband and I were, as my mother put it, living in sin. And by the way, every week she would call me to tell me she was never going to speak to me again. And which was really great. She was a wonderful woman, but oh boy, when she got on her high horse. Anyway, those were the days when I would make sure I got home from work faster than my husband, and those were the days also when you drank martinis. And I would make sure to have the ice.
Still?
Yeah, well, still, yeah, it came back, you know. But anyway, I had an iced martini waiting, and I wore a full-length negligee. I had a little collection of them. And, you know, in New York apartments, the gas stove, normally, at least in those days, the broiler is way down on the floor, down here. And I could remember I had something like a steak or whatever on the broiler, and I would sweep by, and my entire negligee would be smoking, you know. And I would usually just kind of pick up my skirts, go to the sink, wash it off, and just go on. And my husband would, you know, would come and say, "What is that smell?" I thought everybody did it.
Everybody should, at least once in their life. Oh, Lynne, thank you so much.